There's a particular kind of silence that settles over you when you're the only person in a room who actually knows how everything works. Not the silence of being ignored, though I'd experienced plenty of that too. I mean the silence of someone who has already done the math, already seen how the story ends, and is simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. My name is Rachel, and I spent 11 years being that silent person. I spent 11 years building something from nothing while the people around me got louder and louder about how much credit they deserved. And then, in the span of about 48 hours, my business partner and the investors he'd brought in decided they were done with me. What they didn't know, what none of them had ever bothered to find out, was that without me, they didn't actually own anything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, the kind of city where people work hard and don't make a lot of noise about it. My father was an electrical engineer. My mother taught middle school math for 31 years. Neither of them were flashy people. Neither of them raised me to be flashy either. What they did raise me to be was precise, careful, thorough. The kind of person who reads every page of a contract before signing it, who keeps copies of everything, who documents her work not because anyone asked her to, but because she understands that the record of what you've done is sometimes the only protection you have. I met my business partner, Daniel, during our junior year at Ohio State. He was studying marketing. I was deep in computer science, spending most of my free time writing code in the engineering lab while everyone else was at parties. Daniel was the opposite of me in almost every way: magnetic, loud, the kind of guy who walked into a room and immediately became the center of it. We became friends anyway, the way opposites sometimes do, because he could sell an idea to anyone and I could actually build whatever he sold. We complemented each other, at least. That's what I told myself for a long time. After graduation, we spent a few years at separate companies, staying in touch, talking every few weeks about the startup we were eventually going to launch together. In the meantime, I was working 60-hour weeks as a software developer, quietly building expertise in enterprise data systems. I was learning how large companies manage their logistics operations, where the inefficiencies were, what the software solutions on the market were missing. By the time I was 29, I had a very clear picture of a gap in the market. I also had a working prototype of a platform I'd built entirely on my own, in my own time, on my own equipment. That's an important detail. My own time, my own equipment. I brought Daniel in because I knew I couldn't scale it alone. I was brilliant at building the thing. I was not brilliant at walking into a boardroom and convincing a room full of skeptical executives to write a check. Daniel was born for that boardroom. We shook hands, drew up a partnership agreement, one I drafted myself, carefully, with language I'd researched for months, and launched Meridian Systems out of a 2-bedroom apartment in the Short North neighborhood. Me in one bedroom coding, Daniel in the other, on the phone with anyone who would listen. For the first 3 years, it was just the two of us. I wrote every line of the core platform. I built the architecture, designed the security protocols, created the integration framework that let our software connect to the existing systems our clients were already using. That framework was the whole game. Without it, our platform was just another data tool in a market full of data tools. With it, we could plug into almost any enterprise system in the world without the client needing to overhaul their existing infrastructure. It was elegant. It was mine. I want to make sure I'm being clear about that. The framework, the piece of technology that made Meridian actually valuable, I had begun developing it before Daniel and I ever formed the company. I had documentation. I had version histories. I had timestamps going back to a Sunday afternoon in my apartment, 2 years before Meridian Systems was legally incorporated, when I'd written the first proof of concept. And when I eventually filed for copyright protection on that core code base, I filed it in my own name, my personal name, not the company's. At the time, Daniel had barely glanced at the filing. He didn't think it mattered. He was focused on the pitch deck. By year 5, Meridian was serving 43 enterprise clients across the Midwest and Southeast. Our annual revenue had crossed $12 million. We'd hired 22 employees. Daniel had brought in 2 outside investors, a pair of venture capital partners who'd funded 3 other logistics tech companies and liked the idea of adding us to their portfolio. I hadn't loved the idea of outside investment. I preferred to grow at a pace we could sustain organically, but Daniel had pushed for it, and I'd agreed because the terms seemed reasonable and because I trusted my partner. I should have paid more attention to what those investors were really buying. The friction started slowly, the way it usually does. Small comments in meetings, suggestions that the product roadmap should be redirected. One of the investors, a man named Marcus who had strong opinions about everything and deep knowledge of almost nothing technical, started showing up to our weekly strategy calls with ideas about streamlining the platform. What he meant by streamlining, I eventually understood, was replacing my custom integration framework with a cheaper, off-the-shelf solution. He'd found a vendor who could deliver something similar, not as good, not as flexible, but cheaper to maintain, and he had convinced himself that the difference wouldn't matter to clients. I explained, in meeting after meeting, exactly why it would matter. I showed them the data. I walked them through client feedback. I pointed to the specific clauses in our enterprise contracts where clients had chosen us specifically because of our integration capabilities. I laid out, as clearly as I knew how, what we would lose if we made that switch. Do you know what they heard? A woman being difficult about her pet project. Daniel started echoing Marcus in those meetings. Small at first, a hesitation where he used to back me up. A hedge where he used to say, I was right. Then, bigger. Then, one Thursday morning, I walked into a conference room for what I thought was a routine product review and found Marcus, his partner, Daniel, and our head of sales all sitting on one side of the table. There was one chair on the other side. I sat down. I looked at my business partner of 11 years. I said, "What's happening?" Daniel told me they were restructuring the leadership team. They wanted to bring in a new CTO, someone with more experience in scaling enterprise platforms. They were offering me a transition role, a consulting position, technically, that would pay me a reduced salary for 6 months while I helped onboard my replacement. After that, my equity in the company would be bought out at a valuation that Marcus had prepared. I didn't need to see the number to know it would be low. I remember the quality of the silence in that room. Everyone waiting to see if I would cry, or argue, or beg. I did none of those things. I asked 2 questions. First, was this decision final? Daniel said it was. Second, had anyone spoken to our legal team about the transition? Marcus said their attorney had reviewed everything, and it was all in order. I nodded. I said I would need a few days to review the buyout offer. I picked up my laptop and my coffee, and I walked out of that building. In the parking lot, sitting in my car, I allowed myself exactly 10 minutes to feel whatever I was feeling. Betrayal? Yes. Grief? Genuinely, because I had believed in that partnership for over a decade. And underneath both of those, something else. Something quieter. Because in that conference room, listening to Marcus talk about their attorney reviewing everything, I had been running a different calculation in my head, and the number I kept arriving at was one they hadn't accounted for. The core integration framework, the one that powered every contract we had, the one that Marcus wanted to replace, the one that made Meridian worth anything to any of our 43 clients, was protected by a copyright registration I had filed 6 years ago, under my personal name. And the original codebase, the one the platform had been built from, predated the company's incorporation by over 24 months. I had the documentation to prove every second of that timeline. Meridian Systems could remove me from the building. They could bring in a new CTO. They could restructure every department, but they could not use my framework without my permission. And if they couldn't use my framework, they had a very serious problem with every enterprise contract currently active in their system. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't call Marcus. I drove home, made a pot of coffee, and called an intellectual property attorney. Her name was Patricia, and she had been recommended to me years earlier by a friend in the tech industry. I had never needed to use her services before that afternoon. I explained the situation. I sent her the copyright filing, the original code repositories with their timestamps, the partnership agreement Daniel and I had signed at the beginning, and every subsequent amendment. I also sent her the employment agreements for our 22 employees, the enterprise contracts with our clients, and the licensing terms under which Meridian had been operating our platform. She called me back the following morning. She was quiet for a moment before she spoke. Then she said, "Rachel, they have a very significant problem." What followed was 3 weeks that I will never forget for as long as I live. Not because they were dramatic in the way that people imagine confrontations to be dramatic. No shouting, no scenes in hallways, no satisfying moment where I stood up in a boardroom and made a speech. What actually happened was much more methodical than that. Patricia sent a letter to Meridian's legal team. The letter explained, in precise and technical language, the nature of my copyright ownership of the core framework, the evidentiary record, establishing that the code predated the company, and the legal implications of continued use of that framework without a licensing agreement with me personally. I was told later by one of our developers who called me privately, because he thought what had happened to me was wrong, that the day that letter arrived, Marcus left the office early and didn't come back for 2 days. Daniel called me himself. He called me on a Saturday morning, which told me something about how desperate he was, because Daniel never worked on Saturdays. He started the conversation by saying he was sure we could work something out. He said the letter from my attorney had raised some concerns that he wanted to address directly between us, partner to partner, before things got any further. I let him talk. I had learned, over 11 years, that Daniel could fill a silence better than almost anyone I'd ever met, and that if you gave him enough time, he would eventually tell you exactly what he was afraid of. That morning, what he was afraid of was losing every major client contract Meridian had, because those clients had chosen us specifically for capabilities that, as it turned out, the company did not actually own outright. Their new CTO, who had been hired while I was still reviewing the buyout offer, had spent 2 weeks trying to understand the framework before concluding that it could not be replicated on any reasonable timeline. The off-the-shelf solution Marcus had been so excited about couldn't come close to replicating what mine did. 3 enterprise clients had already been notified of a potential disruption to their service continuity, and 2 of them had begun asking questions about their contracts. I listened to Daniel talk for 20 minutes. Then I told him I would have Patricia reach out to their legal team on Monday. The negotiation took 6 weeks. I want to be honest, it was not a clean or pleasant 6 weeks. There were moments when their attorneys tried to argue that the framework had been developed using company resources. I had anticipated this. I had documentation, time-stamped code commits from my personal laptop, utility bills showing my home address where the work had been done, a detailed log I'd kept, somewhat obsessively, of every tool and resource I had used during development. Patricia presented that documentation in a manner that left very little room for argument. In the end, Meridian Systems had 3 options. They could license my framework from me at a rate that Patricia and I had determined was fair market value. They could purchase the framework outright, at a valuation reflecting its actual contribution to the company's revenue and growth trajectory. Or they could attempt to rebuild their platform from scratch without it, which their own technical team had already advised them would take somewhere between 18 months and 2 years and would require significant client renegotiation in the interim. Marcus pushed for option 3. He did not like the other numbers. Their technical team pushed back against Marcus. Their clients pushed back. 2 of the investors who'd come in with Marcus, not Marcus himself, but the others he'd brought along later, quietly made it clear to Daniel that they thought Marcus's approach was going to destroy the company before they could recover. I know all of this because people talk, and because Daniel, to his credit, eventually became honest with me in a way he hadn't been in years. They chose option 2. They bought the framework at the valuation Patricia had established. They also revised my buyout figure significantly to reflect the accurate value of my equity given the company's actual asset base. I signed the agreements on a Wednesday afternoon, in Patricia's conference room, with a cup of coffee I barely touched. I want to tell you what I felt walking out of that building, because I've thought about it a lot since then. I think people expect a revenge story to end with triumph, with some feeling of having won, of the other person having lost, of justice dispensed like a verdict. What I actually felt was something quieter than that. Tired, a little sad. 11 years is a long time. Daniel and I had built something real together, and the fact that he had allowed other people's voices to drown out his own judgment about what was fair, that was genuinely painful to me. In a way, the professional betrayal wasn't. But I also felt something else underneath the tiredness. A kind of solid certainty that I had never felt before. The certainty that comes from knowing that you did the work, that you documented it, that you never let anyone talk you out of protecting what was yours, even when doing so felt overly cautious or strange, or like you were being paranoid. That the quiet, careful choices you made years before anyone was paying attention had turned out to be the most important choices you ever made. I used the settlement to launch my next company. I took 3 of Meridian's developers, with me, the ones who'd called me privately during those 6 weeks, the ones who'd been frustrated for years by the direction the company was heading. I am not going to tell you the name of what we built, because we're still building it, and I've learned to be careful about what I say in public before something is ready. What I will tell you is that we own everything. Every line of code, every filing, every contract. I read everything before I sign it. I keep copies of everything. I document every significant piece of work the moment it's created. Old habits. Meridian still exists. I check in occasionally, not out of bitterness, just because it's hard to spend 11 years building something and then fully stop caring about it. They made the switch to the off-the-shelf solution eventually, about 18 months after I left. 2 of their largest clients didn't renew their contracts. Marcus stepped back from an active role a few months after that. I don't know the details, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to. Daniel sent me a message last year. It was brief. He said he'd made mistakes, and he knew it. He said he hoped things were going well for me. I read it twice, then put my phone down and went back to work. I didn't respond, and I'm not sure what I would have said if I had. That I don't harbor any dramatic feelings toward him. That's true. Mostly. That I understand how someone can let the wrong voices get too loud. That's also true. That 11 years of trust is hard to rebuild with a paragraph. That's the truest thing of all. What I've learned, and I've thought about how to say this carefully, because I don't want it to sound like a tidy lesson wrapped around a messy experience, is that the real power is almost never where the noise is. In every room I've ever been in, the loudest person was performing. Performing confidence, performing authority, performing certainty. Performance is useful. Daniel was genuinely good at it. But performance doesn't write the code. Performance doesn't build the architecture. Performance doesn't sit alone at a desk on a Sunday afternoon and solve the problem that everyone else said couldn't be solved. The people doing that work are usually quiet about it, not because they're passive or resigned or unaware of their own value, but because the work itself is the point. The documentation is the point. The care, the precision, the long, slow accumulation of things done correctly. That's the point. And when the moment comes where someone tries to take what you've built, all of that quiet, careful work becomes something that no boardroom vote and no restructuring memo can touch. I've had a lot of people ask me, since the story got around, whether I was scared during those 6 weeks, whether I doubted myself, whether there were moments when I thought maybe I should have accepted the original buyout offer and moved on. The honest answer is no. I knew what I had. I had always known. That's the thing about doing the work and documenting the work and protecting the work. It doesn't leave a lot of room for doubt. You either own what you built, or you don't. And if the paper trail is solid, that question has a clear answer. What I was, during those 6 weeks, was focused. The same way I've always been focused. The same way I was on that Sunday afternoon in my apartment years ago, before any of this, when I was just a woman with a laptop and an idea and absolutely no interest in being distracted from solving the problem in front of me. Some people will always underestimate that kind of focus. They'll mistake quietness for weakness, or precision for timidity, or documentation for obsession. Let them. Every assumption they make is a miscalculation they'll have to correct later. And when they call, trying to correct it, make sure your attorney is already up to speed. Because if you've done the work right, the call is coming. It's really only a matter of when.